Hey guys, so we're a few weeks into 2024 and I decided to bring in the new year with a list of my top 15 favorite films to come out in 2023. Now keep in mind, this is just my personal list. Some people might highly disagree with some of the movies on this list, but these are just my personal favorite films of 2023. And speaking of a movie that people might highly disagree with me on, my number 15 is a film that I know was very divisive, and I totally understand why people did not like this movie, but you know what? This movie worked for me. My number 15 is Skidamarink. Now, if you want to say this movie is boring or pretentious, that's totally within your right, and I get it, and I will agree, I think the film was way longer than it needed to be. You could have cut 40 minutes out of this movie at least. But you know what? Again, it worked for me. I appreciate experimental films, especially experimental horror films, and I thought Kyle Edward Ball perfectly captured the feeling of a childhood nightmare with this movie, because I remember being a little kid, being 4 or 5 years old and being up alone at night while my parents are asleep, feeling like I'm the only person awake in the entire world, and when you're that age, the idea that there could be a monster in your closet or under your bed or in the attic or in the basement or in a dark room when the lights are turned off, that's a perfectly rational thought for a 4-year-old. And I think this movie captured those feelings very well. Again, I totally understand why people did not like this movie, but for me, it worked. I thought this was a very effective movie. The basic premise of the movie is we follow these two little kids who wake up one day to find all the doors and windows to their house have mysteriously disappeared. Their parents are gone, and it appears that there's some kind of presence in the house with them. And there are so many different ways you could interpret the movie. You could interpret it literally, like some kind of interdimensional being has literally abducted these children and trapped them in some kind of a time loop. You could interpret it as these kids are dead and this is purgatory, or maybe for some god-awful reason these kids have been sent to hell and this entity is actually the devil. Or you could interpret it as this is just a nightmare that one of these kids are having. There really is no right or wrong interpretation with this movie, but even the nightmare interpretation, even that has kind of a sinister subtext, because what is this nightmare reflecting? Like, what kind of real-world thing is this nightmare a reflection of? Again, many different interpretations you could have, or you could just interpret the film as just being artsy for artsy's sake and being pretentious for pretentiousness sake. And again, if you want to say that, you're not wrong. I totally get why people did not like this. Number 14 on my list is Killers of the Flower Moon, Martin Scorsese's most recent film, and it is amazing to me that Martin Scorsese is in his 80s, and yet the man is still kicking ass. He's still out there making great movies, and this guy came from the New Hollywood era, and he's one of the last remaining New Hollywood directors who is still doing great movies today. Now, the movie's based on a true story. I'll admit, I don't know much about the actual story outside of what's presented in the film, and I don't know how accurate the movie is to the real events, but the movie that Martin Scorsese makes is very compelling and incredibly well made and incredibly well acted, and also genuinely horrifying. The idea that this guy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, comes off as a loving family man, seems like he's a good husband to his wife and kids, but then you realize that he's out there helping his uncle kill his wife's people so they could get the oil rights. But something that Martin Scorsese does not get enough credit for is he does not glorify crime. I actually consider his movies to be more like morality plays, because if you actually watch movies like Killers of the Flower Moon or Wolf of Wall Street or Goodfellas, he's showing you exactly why you don't want to get involved in the world of crime, because the protagonists of Martin Scorsese's movies usually have their entire world fall down on top of them by the end of the film. Like, in my opinion, he does the exact opposite of glorifying crime, and again, I don't think people give him enough credit for that. Number 13 on my list is Michael Mann's Ferrari, another movie based on a true story. Now, I'll admit, I knew nothing about the real-life Enzo Ferrari before I saw this movie. Of course, I've heard the name Ferrari before. I knew it was a kind of a race car, but that's really all I knew about it. I knew nothing about the man's real life, and I knew nothing about the story that this movie depicts. Now, the film is less of a biopic on Ferrari's entire life. Rather, it depicts a certain event that happened in the summer of 1957 in Italy. And again, it was a story I was completely unfamiliar with, so when I saw this movie, I was genuinely shocked by the film's ending. And thank God I was sitting by myself in the theater, because I audibly said, "Holy shit," at the end of this movie. And they did a really good job with the makeup in this movie, making Adam Driver look older. And Adam Driver does such a great job in this movie, depicting this deeply flawed man, and a man who legitimately has a lot of regrets. But you know who really stole this movie? Penelope Cruz. And I know nothing about cars or racing, but Michael Mann did a great job at actually making it look interesting. Number 12 on my list is Saltburn, a movie that I knew very little about going in. I actually saw this on Thanksgiving because I have kind of a weird tradition where every Thanksgiving, after I have dinner with my family, I end up going out to see a movie. It's just sort of a tradition I've done now for a few years on Thanksgiving. But I saw like a few ads of the movie on YouTube, and I'll admit, as I was watching the movie, I thought it was a little slow at first, but then when certain things are revealed about the main character, and then by the film's ending, I was like, you know what? This movie was kind of fucking brilliant. And the movie goes from being kind of a bittersweet college coming-of-age movie to a dark comedy to eventually an erotic thriller, and then finally full-blown psychological horror by the end of the movie. And it really felt like a weird mix between American Psycho and Fall of the House of Usher. Number 11 on my list is Poor Things, which is essentially a take on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And yes, I know it's based on a book from the 90s, but obviously both this movie and the book that it's based on are essentially Frankenstein parables, and there actually are a lot of really interesting references to Mary Shelley in the movie. For example, Willem Dafoe's character in the movie is named Godwin, and Godwin was actually Mary Shelley's maiden name. The movie's basically about this mad scientist who brings back a woman who recently committed suicide, but she's not really the woman she was before she killed herself. She's a new person, and the whole movie is really about this woman's journey of self-discovery and discovering who she is. The film definitely has a feminist undercurrent where it's really this woman's sexual independence that scares the shit out of most of the male characters in the movie, especially Mark Ruffalo's character. And Mark Ruffalo was fucking hilarious in this movie. His character was such a scumbag, yet there were moments where you did kind of empathize with him a little bit. And Emma Stone was a fucking powerhouse in this movie. Number 10 on my list is When Evil Lurks, which presents a very unique take on demonic possession. Now, the film seems to be set in either a dystopic near future or sort of an alternate universe where demonic possession is a widespread and commonplace thing. Like, people know about it and society just now has to deal with it. Now, it's implied in the movie that religion Wrestlin is completely dead, that God has no more power anymore, and essentially the fallen angels now reign supreme over the earth. But the movie treats demonic possession almost like a virus, and something that you have to handle like a virus, and when you don't, it can spread. And there are some very shocking scenes in this movie. I would almost describe the film as Evil Dead meets Children of the Corn. Number 9 on my list is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, I know people at this point are getting sick of the MCU movies, and I do think the Marvel Cinematic Universe definitely hit their peak with Endgame. That being said, I think Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 might actually be the best of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. And I liked how in this movie, Rocket really is the main character, and the backstory that they present for him in this movie is so freaking heartbreaking. And the villain of this movie might be one of the best villains of the MCU. And truth be told, I would much rather this guy be the next big bad of the MCU as opposed to Kang. And considering all the legal trouble that Jonathan Majors is currently in, I have a feeling that Marvel is majorly retooling a lot of the plans that they had for that character. Number 8 on my list is the Iron Claw. Now, I know nothing about wrestling. It was never really my thing, so I knew nothing about the true story of the Von Erich family, but the story that's presented in this movie is so heartbreaking and so emotionally moving. It also gave me a new respect for the sport of wrestling, which again is not a sport I really give two fucks about. And I like how, even though by no means do I think the film is a condemnation of the sport, it does show you how even though wrestling was the thing that this entire family's lives revolved around, it was also simultaneously the thing that kind of destroyed a lot of their lives too. The movie also hit me pretty hard because I recently lost an uncle, and when you find out that certain characters have passed on, it strikes a chord. Number 7 on my list is Infinity Pool, one of the most brutally original sci-fi horror films in a long time. Now, the film was directed by Brendan Cronenberg, who is actually David Cronenberg's son, and you definitely see a lot of his father in this movie. It definitely reminded me of stuff like Videodrome and Crash. At the same time, the film definitely had an identity all its own, and the film was very original, very scary, but also very funny as well. And Mia Goth, my god, she fucking stole this movie. Number 6 on my list is Oppenheimer. Now, I've always had an interest in World War II, and especially the Cold War, so of course I knew who J. Robert Oppenheimer was, but I'll also be the first to admit that I'm not an expert on the man, and I don't know how accurate the movie is to the real person. The movie is told in a very non-linear style, and it's constantly jumping back and forth between different periods of Oppenheimer's life, from him working on the Manhattan Project that led to the development of the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II, to later on him being investigated for his communist ties. And Cillian Murphy does such a great job in this movie, playing a man who feels that he may have just damned the world, because even to this day, we still live in the shadow of the atomic bomb. There is still so much debate on whether we should have dropped the atomic bombs on Japan or not, whether it was really the ethically sound decision to do, and even to this day, the threat of nuclear annihilation still exists. Yeah, the Cold War was over for a while, but today we definitely still have problems with Russia and China and North Korea, so again, we're still living in the shadow of the atomic bomb, and that makes the film's final shot and the final line of the film all the more chilling. Number 5 on my list is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, and as much as superhero fatigue has kind of been setting in these last couple of years, I think this movie does prove that you can can still have good storytelling in a superhero film, and you can still have good artistry in a superhero film. And what I really liked about this is this doesn't just do a lot of really interesting things with the whole multiverse concept, but it also does a lot of really cool things with animation in general. Like when they enter different universes, you notice the art style is slightly different depending on which universe you're in, and they do these things where the background changes depending on a character's mood. Like there's a really interesting sequence in the film involving watercolor. Like they do some like really interesting stuff with the art form of animation, and at its heart the movie tells a really good, very human story about this young man simply trying to find his place in the world, or multiverse rather, and also about this young man trying to fight his destiny and trying to change his destiny. And the movie features the Spot, one of the lesser-known Spider-Man villains, as the main antagonist, and the backstory they give him in this movie is actually pretty tragic. But in the beginning, he's really funny, but as the film goes on and you see this character become more and more unhinged, he becomes genuinely pretty terrifying, and I'm really excited to see what they do with the third film of this Miles Morales trilogy. Number 4 on my list is The Outwarders, which I first found out about last year because the trailer was shown in front of Terrifier 2, and when I saw that trailer I was like, I have to see this movie. And when I saw the movie, luckily I was not disappointed. I know some people were, because I know, like, kind of like Skinamarink, this was kind of divisive, but in my opinion, The Outwarders might be one of the most effective found footage horror films since the Blair Witch Project. The basic premise is it's about this group of people who go out to the desert to shoot a music video, but then they encounter something in the desert. And that's all I want to say about this movie, but this was fucking terrifying, and there are some brutal and genuinely shocking scenes in this movie. It kind of felt like, to me, and this is oversimplifying it, but it almost felt like Event Horizon meets As Above, So Below meets The Thing. Number 3 on my list is The Holdovers, one of the funniest, but also one of the most emotionally moving films of 2023. Set in the 1970s at an all-boys boarding school, we follow this kid who's left behind for the Christmas break, and this crotchety-ass professor has to watch over him, and at first they hate each other, but as the movie goes on, they start to understand each other a little bit more, and you do start to see kind of a friendship develop between the two of them, while they also admit that they're both pains in the asses. And what I like about this movie is the two main characters are assholes, but as it goes on, you start to understand why they're assholes. And the movie's hilarious, but it does have some genuinely heart-wrenching moments, especially when it starts to dive more into Telly's backstory. And all the acting in the movie is great across the board, from Paul Giamatti to Divine Joy Randolph, but the kid who plays Telly, I think his name is Dominic Sessa, this kid is definitely going places based on his performance in this movie. Like, I would be very surprised if this kid is not a bigger name in the next 5 years. Number 2 on my list is Talk to Me, which I would almost describe as A24 does a Blumhouse movie, because this really does feel like a slightly smarter version of the kind of movies that Blumhouse typically puts out. But the film is also a really interesting commentary on peer pressure, but also on grief and loss, and also about loneliness. I think loneliness might be the main theme of the film. The movie blends horror, drama, and a little bit of dark humor really well, and there are some genuinely shocking scenes in this movie. This movie also has a scene that may or may not take place in hell, and it's one of the most terrifying depictions of hell or even the afterlife that I've ever seen. And it's literally only 1 or 2 shots, but that scene that's in what could be hell genuinely haunted me for days after seeing this movie. And my number one favorite film of 2023 is Godzilla Minus One. Now, if you know me, you know I'm a pretty big Godzilla fan, but this wasn't just a great Godzilla movie, this was a great film in general. Now, I've said it many times before, but the original Godzilla from 1954 is my favorite film of all time. Not just my favorite monster film, and not just my favorite horror or science fiction film, it's my favorite film of any genre. And while I'm a huge fan of the Godzilla franchise overall, very few of the other films before this came even close to matching the tone and themes and the sheer power of the original film. The closest before this, I would say, would be something like Godzilla 1985 or Shin Godzilla. But this movie, I think, officially came the closest to matching the original film, and you could argue is a better film than the original Godzilla. Because very much like the original Godzilla, this movie really does play out like a human drama, really about the traumas of World War II, once again being visited upon Japan in the form of a giant monster. Now, Godzilla was always meant to be an allegory for the atomic bomb, but in this movie, Godzilla really does feel like the shadow of World War II. He's the shadow of World War II made flesh. And I definitely think this has the best human story in a Godzilla film since the original. And I'm so glad that it seems like American audiences have been really receptive to this movie. Like, I think this is going to go a long way in getting people to actually take Godzilla seriously and understand that Godzilla is not just some stupid children's fare. Like, there actually are Godzilla movies that have real meaning to them. I do have some minor nitpicks, particularly with the film's ending, but overall, I thought this was a great movie. Now, before I end this video, here are a few honorable mentions. Dream Scenario, Thanksgiving. I'm not a huge Eli Roth fan, but this movie really did hit me just right. Even though there's a lot of stuff with social media in the film, this really did feel like a throwback to a classic 80s slasher film. Like, it reminded me a lot of stuff like My Bloody Valentine and movies like that. Sisu, if I'm saying the name of the movie right, and I gotta say, there is something very cathartic about watching Nazis get blown the fuck up. And my final honorable mention would be Cocaine Bear. So yeah, that was my list on my top 15 favorite films of 2023. Let me know what you thought of this list. Let me know if you liked or hated any of the movies on this list, and let me know what your personal favorite films of last year were.